Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with 4 weeks of famous philosophers, which is, yes, I understand, much longer than 4 weeks. And today we're going to be looking at G.E. Moore, father of analytic philosophy, questioner of good, and arch defender of common sense. Now, along with Russell, Wittgenstein, and others, G.E. Moore is considered really one of the founders of analytic philosophy. Moore was famous for his critiques of idealism, skepticism, and ethical naturalism. He was a great champion of common sense philosophy, and you'll really understand what that means when we get to it. And quite influential in sense data and the philosophy of perception. He also did a good deal of work on kind of philosophical analysis and what the projects of philosophy really were, and in that way contributed importantly to what we understand as analytic philosophy today. So first off, the life of G.E. Moore. He was born George Edward Moore in 1873, but Moore absolutely hated his first and middle names. That's why you rarely will see a philosophical paper by George Edward Moore. You'll always see it by G.E. Moore. His professional colleagues just called him Moore, while his wife actually referred to him as Bill. His father was a physician and author George Moore, and his brother was the poet and author Thomas Sturge Moore. In his youth, Moore was interested much more by the puzzles of philosophy than the mystery of science. He was truly fascinated that philosophy had failed to defend the most basic of commonly held beliefs, like belief in the external world. For Moore, it should be philosophy's job to, in some way, defend those common sense beliefs, and it was strange that we hadn't been able to do what seemed to him to be a very simple task in so long. He eventually became a fellow at Cambridge, where he met Bertrand Russell, of course, as well as such greats as John McTaggart, Ellis McTaggart, who is famous for the unreality of time argument. He would stay studying and then leave and then come back and be later working at Cambridge for pretty much most of the rest of his life. Along with Russell and Wittgenstein, he would make Cambridge one of the greatest locations for philosophy in the world at the time. He died in 1958 and was cremated in Cambridge. A very contrasting life to the life of Bertrand Russell, who traveled around the world, had many different wives. Moore lived most of his life in and around Cambridge and worked and studied there for most of his time. However, though contrasting experiences, Moore and Russell were both very influential on the founding and creation of analytic philosophy. Moore fought valiantly for common sense notions of reality against the positions of idealism and skepticism especially. One of his most famous arguments offered in his Proof of an External World was holding up his hands and saying, "This is one hand, this is another, therefore external objects exist." In this case, from many interpretations, he was actually arguing against the metaphysical position of idealism, not in fact arguing against skepticism when he famously did the "this is one hand, this is the other." He was arguing against the claim that everything is mental, saying, look, here's a physical object right here, here's a physical object right here. Clearly everything's not mental. He claimed in his arguments that all versions of kind of the idealist claim to be is to be perceived were either false or tautologous. Elsewhere, he did offer a very similar argument against skepticism, which is one of the reasons these things get a little bit confused, which turned the classic academic skepticism argument on its head. He basically agreed with the premise that if we are in a skeptical scenario, then we cannot know that there is a hand in front of our face. But he said, we do in fact know that there's a hand in front of our face, and therefore can conclude via modus tollens that we are not in a skeptical scenario. Kind of taking that classic academic skepticism argument and just turning it on its head and saying, as the phrase goes, one man's modus pollens is another man's modus tollens. Maybe that's not a phrase most people use. Anyway, moving on to analysis, if philosophers were not to be engaged in endless debate over the nature of reality or how we can show what we know, what were they to do? In Moore's view, a central element of philosophy should be the analysis of propositions, and he was fascinated by Russell's work in propositions and the understanding of propositions. This focus on solving isolated problems or understanding individual concepts throughout philosophy through conceptual analysis instead of building a kind of full, all-encompassing theory of the world, would serve as a central pillar of analytic philosophy moving forward, and More's work on analysis would survive much longer and be much more influential than any of More's individual theories. More was also very influential in the realm of ethics, challenging the idea that morality is a natural phenomenon through the use of his open question argument, which has a lot of parallels to Russell's barren tautologies. Basically, this argument claimed that if good was natural, if we had a way to actually define good, it would be a barren tautology, which would not give us new information about good. It would be strange for me to get a definition of dog, which would make my understanding of dog include a lot more things or a lot fewer things. It would seem that doesn't really define dog, it adds more information to that. However, since all of our ethical theories would cause us to have different understandings of what is good, we're not really defining it. We're adding a new concept on that maybe that new concept is natural, but good itself is not natural. Therefore, according to More, since we can't offer a barren tautology or understand the open question of what is good, good is not natural. This argument continues to be an influential one in metaethical theory to this day. Therefore, I give you G.E. More, father of analytic philosophy, questioner of good, and arch defender of common sense. Next up, we are going to be looking at Ludwig Wittgenstein, who is arguably one of the most famous philosophers of the 20th century, or the most influential ones, and clearly the third of this kind of trinity at Cambridge who set up analytic philosophy in some ways. So, watch that video, hopefully coming much sooner than this one came after the last one, and watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.